My name is Gian Maria Campedelli. I am a research scientist at Fondazione Bruno Kessler. It's a research foundation in Italy. I'm working in a unit that specifically deals with computational models to study society at large. I am specifically a criminologist. I obtained my degree in criminology from Catholic University in Milan, Italy, 2020. Before that, I also worked as a visiting research scholar at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, so very close to Cleveland, in 2018. And then I worked as a researcher at Transcrime, which is this center in Milan that deals with transnational crime. So my research is mostly dealing with data and computational methods, including artificial intelligence and causal inference approaches to study crime and a different phenomena within crime. So I started my career with organized crime, and then I'm still working on organized crime, but I'm also moving. I've been moving in the past years towards homicides in America, in the U.S. And actually, this study is one of the studies that came out of that line of research, and particularly actually the disparity in terms of clearance probability between Black victims and non-Black victims that are, in general, mostly white. So I would say I have a diverse portfolio, but this line is definitely one I am really excited about.
Well, yes, thank you for joining us. And we are going to be talking about your article, Homicides Involving Black Victims Are Less Likely to Be Cleared in the United States. So if you would, please just give us an overview of what this article attempted to do and what you found out kind of briefly, and then we'll dig into some specifics.
Sure. So how this originated is pretty standard in research. I was working on another paper that was published a couple of years ago in the Journal of Criminal Justice, and I was trying to use this machine learning method to try to predict what are the factors that better explain what is the likelihood for an homicide to be cleared in the United States. And I was not specifically looking at race, but race was one of the race of the victims was one of the factors that were included in those models. And I realized that there was some sort of like variability. There were some states, there were some areas in the country in which actually the race of the victim was very important in explaining the probability of for an homicide to be cleared. So once I concluded that project, I was drawn to that question very easily. And I was like, okay, let me see and let me dig into the data a little bit more and try to understand whether, race of the victim actually has something to do with the probability of clearance in an homicide. So I discovered this huge literature that goes back basically decades ago, where researchers and scholars already, investigated the problem. So it is really the let's say the victim features, the characteristics of the victim. So not only race, are they important in explaining the probability for an homicide to be cleared? So I dig into the literature, and I found that in the past years that have been quite a good deal of quantitative articles looking at the statistics. I was not totally satisfied with how those articles were tackling that problem, because many articles just looked at some counties or cities or states, maybe for just a few years. The methodology was not, as solid as I would have hoped. So I was like, okay, let me try to tackle this quick. So really, the paper is and actually the results in the literature were very, let's say, contradictory. So there were studies that were showing that actually being Black or being part of a minority group explains somehow the probability for an homicide to be cleared. Other studies that didn't find any effect. So it's like, okay, let's try to, put some more robust answers to that question. And so I took all the data that I could. Basically, it's two sources plus one. And I tried to come up with the most solid research design that I could to end up having not only correlational or descriptive measures, but as much as causal answers. So what I found, and now maybe then we'll dig into the detail of how I did that, but what I found is actually, yes, there's a lower probability for an homicide that against the Black victim to be cleared compared to an homicide when the victim is not Black. And again, I want to stress that when it's not Black, it means that we're talking about 90% of homicides with known Black victims that are actually white victims. So I'd say that we can really come up with this dichotomy. So, Black victims and white victims here. And this effect goes from around 3.4 to 4.8 decrease in the probability, which might seem tiny, but it's not. If we go back to the raw numbers, we're talking about every 50,000 homicide victims, we're talking about 1,700 to 2,400 less cleared cases just because of race.
Well, yeah, and that's very important to look at, because I think a lot of the focus in this arena has been on incarceration and perpetrators, and there has not been as much attention put on victims of crime. So I think this is incredibly important work in reframing that discussion a little bit. But to begin our discussion, I'd love for you to tell us what the contradictions in the literature showed to begin with. And I'm thinking, like, you get into, it got very complicated, but there's Black's theory of law, discretionary, and amount of law, all these different kind of theories that looked at the data prior. So if you could kind of tell us what the competing ideas were that were out there.
Sure. So there were, let's say, two main school of thoughts, two main tradition in terms of like the homicide clearance literature. The first one was actually it's called the discretionary perspective, and it was heralded by Donald Black. He wrote some seminal works back in the 70s. They were not specifically on homicide clearance, but they were actually dealing with the amount of law one person received as a function of the characteristics of the person itself. So starting from that tradition, basically scholars starting with Black and then beginning with more empirical works in the more recent decades, posited that basically the probability that one crime or one homicide in this case is solved is based on the characteristics of the victim, because there are characteristics that police tend to devaluate. So, being part of a minority group, but also living in a low income neighborhood, or being part of some sort of like disadvantaged group of the population. So there's this sort of like theory saying that if you are at the margins of society, or if you are part of a minority, you are less likely to receive the same amount of law that a white person, wealth person will receive, because of police putting less effort, less resources, less value of that. And then another, let's say the adversarial theory was like this non-discretionary theory that had different champions. And the champions of this perspective were positing that the probability that an homicide is cleared are not due to the individual factors, let's say, characterizing the victim, but are more related to the characteristics of the event in per se. So just to exemplify, if I am committing an homicide using a firearm, for example, the odds that I get away with it are higher compared to an homicide that is perpetrated by using a knife. Why? Because, using a knife, there's a contact, so there's higher probability that you will leave some traces back, and then the police can figure out who did that. So, and there's been this, sort of like big discussion in the literature for so long, and starting from these two perspectives, there have been other different perspectives coming out of that. Other perspectives that originates from those two are, for example, the fact that the built environment can explain, the odds So there are maybe parts of that that goes into the direction of the discretionary perspective, and other parts of that that goes into the non-discretionary perspective. Another complementary theory is the police, what I call the police resources. So if you are a police agency that has much more resources, much more access to technologies, and more detectives per capita, then you're probably more likely to solve more homicides. Now, what I try to demonstrate with this article is that there's no need to really go into this contraposition between the two. I think everything. So there's no need to go into just one theory. It's just that not just one theory can explain the complexity of how homicides clear and, of course, so the patterns that we see in data. It's probably a mixture of different things. And to come up with the estimates that I have in the paper, I actually take into account the factors that are typical of the non-discretionary perspective. To control for that is the statistical jargon, to make sure that we put them into the equation so that in the end we can isolate the real effect of race. So that's in a nutshell, really what has going on in the past, let's say, 5 decades of literature.
Well, yeah, and that's it. I think some of these arguments have seeped into popular culture in different ways. So it's interesting to see where they've come from. But the way the data you collected and what you looked at was incredibly impressive, at least to me, from a non-scientific basis. So would you talk about the databases you used and how you designed the survey to be more inclusive? So it wasn't specific to a city and a time frame, but you tried to grab everything, right?
Yes. So I would say that it's not so much my merit. I deal with statistical tools and methods, so I would say that's kind of standard. But so the resources were two. The first one is the Murder Accountability Project dataset, which is basically, and this one person that people should thank is Thomas Hargrove, who is the actual director of this Murder Accountability Project. So what this person did in the past years was to try to use collecting data from the UCR, Supplementary Homicide Reports data, which is used to be a standard source for research on homicide, and then submitted FOIA requests to make sure that he also collected homicide reports that were not originally reported by agencies to the FBI. So to make sure that, let's say, we shrink the gap between the FBI data on homicide and, for example, the CDC data on homicide. So he did a great work on that. And I used those data as a first source. We're talking about 500,000 homicides from 1991 to 2020. Now, that data set has some problems in the sense that it has a huge representativity and coverage, the entire country. However, it does not have an official measure of whether an homicide was actually cleared. He used some sort of like proxy, which was, for example, if let's say the police agency didn't report the sex of the victim, then he defined that homicide as uncleared, which of course has some problems, but that's how we define that. And then I also use the NIBRS data set. The NIBRS is the new system that all police agencies in the country should comply to from 2022. It was in place well before that, but it had a lot of problems because agencies were not reporting to the NIBRS system. So I let's say, retrieved all the data that I could from the NIBRS system from 1991 to 2020 again. And in that case, we're talking about not 500,000 homicides, but we're talking about slightly less than 100,000 homicides. So in that case, the NIBRS system and the NIBRS data set has, let's say, much more problems in terms of coverage and representativity. Because, for example, California, that is the state with the higher count of homicides in the murder accountability data set, was not represented in the NIBRS. And for example, the state of New York and the NIBRS only had 22 homicides over the 1991 2020 period, which is of course not true. However, the NIBRS had one merit, which is it has an official measure from the police agency on whether an homicide was clear. So now, what I did was I wanted to take these two data sets that had more or less the same amount of information per each homicide, but had, let's say, benefits and let's say pros and cons. On one side, representativity coverage, but lack of an official measure. On the other side, presence of an official measure, but way less coverage. And so I wanted just to create these models and see whether there was some sort of like convergence on what I was investigating. And actually, it ends up being like that. There's some sort of like convergence. So when I'm talking about from 3.4% to 4.8%, that's the estimate that I had based on the model and the data set. But it's incredibly similar. And then I also use the Murder with Impunity project data set from the Washington Post as sort of like robustness. That data set was good to use, but it has some problems because it used 50,000 homicides from the 50 largest American cities from 2007 to 2017. But I saw that it does not really represent the actual, let's say, patterns in homicides in the U.S. What I'm saying is, for example, in the Murder with Impunity project from the Washington Post, there were a lot more Black victims rather than the other two. So it was, let's say, overrepresenting Black victims compared to white victims. So, but I used that as well. And again, the estimate kind of, went in that direction.
Yeah, and when you looked at all the data, you came up with basically three hypotheses. And I'd like you to talk about those and then maybe how it was supported by what you found.
Sure. So the main hypothesis was just really understanding: is it true that is there a race gap in the probability of clearance? So that's the main thing what we've been talking about so far. And then the second hypothesis and the third hypothesis were, let's say, attempts to go into a little bit more nuanced investigation of what happened. So I was investigating whether the divide can be also disaggregated by sex. So whether male victims or female victims have different odds, or this race gap is larger for some of the categories, either of the two. And then in the third hypothesis was actually, or probably was the other way around, but it doesn't matter. Was actually whether this gap changed over time. So I looked at the 3 different decades. And the results are interesting. They are, let's say, from a statistical point of view, interesting, from probably, broader perspective, less impressive. But what we see is that, actually males suffer from this race gap more than females. It's a statistically significant effect. I won't, dig into the details of what that means, but it's robust, let's say, but it's not a huge effect. So it's not that Black male victims are suffering from this race gap hugely more than female Black victims. But there's a tiny effect there. So, and then regarding the temporal disaggregation, the effects are small, but it's interesting to me that the gap widened over the decades. So it's not getting better, which is, very, very, it's dramatic. It's terrible, because there's a piece of literature coming out recently saying that the huge drop in homicide clearance in general in the U.S. is explained by the fact that in the past decades that have been an increase in the terms of like the standards for arrest of people. So now you're not just arrested based on circumstantial evidence, but let's say that the standards could be higher than in the past. So that's why we see this decrease in arrests per homicide. But net of that, regardless of that, we still see that this race gap increases tinily, but it increases. So 2000, let's say the past decade was worse than the previous decade and was even worse than the 90s. So these were the other two, let's say, more nuanced analysis that I could do. And one thing that I wanted to mention is that I could just look at man versus female because the data for other gender was not, rich enough, and probably back in the day was not, as carefully reported as it would be today. So unfortunately, I couldn't look at that too. So non-binary categories, that was not my choice. It was not a matter of. It was a matter of not having the sufficient data to, investigate that direction. But yes.
So I have a couple final questions, but one of the ones that I think to just kind of wrap up the data is what you found then kind of it does support what is the discretionary perspective, right? So let's talk a little bit about what that might mean.
Yeah, so that's a tricky question. I released an interview with The Guardian, the US edition, a couple of months ago. And what I was trying to say is that, what I try to say and write in the paper is that I certainly can answer to the question, is there a gap here in terms of race? So are, Black victims less likely to receive justice? Are families of Black victims less likely to receive justice? And the answer to that, which is the most solid we can come up with in the literature so far, is yes, for sure. And that's the effect. Now, it's much more difficult to say why does that happen. So the statistical results go in the direction of the discretionary perspective. But I'm not comfortable in saying, or I cannot really say with the data that I have, with the method that I deployed, why this happened. So there are theories, of course. There was an interesting paper coming out that was published, let's say, a couple of years ago, maybe it's more than a couple of years ago, where it was published in the British Journal of Criminology, where scholars when interview police officers and detectives in a large metropolitan police agency in the US, and they got interviewed. So it was more like qualitative research there. And they came up with this conclusion that simply there's some sort of like devaluation of the victim. There's this sort of like hierarchy of the victim. Of course, if the son of a billionaire, gets murdered, it gets more attention, more pressure from the public. The police agency has to respond, quicker and more effectively. If the son of a person that is living, of a Black person that is living in a disadvantaged area, and it's different, of course. That was their conclusion. Now, I cannot answer to that point. So the statistical results go in the direction of the discretionary perspective. Now, why is that? It can be that there's some sort of like devaluation. That's one hypothesis. One other hypothesis that, which I find intriguing, is that maybe there's some sort of like difference between the composition of the police agency and the communities that they serve. So there's some sort of like gap in the ability to communicate, get in touch with them. Another perspective that I tend to dislike, let's say, is people say, okay, there's some sort of like racial gap, but that, the Black communities are to blame because they won't go, to testify, they won't help the police in the investigation. So I find it really, hateful as an explanation, because you are putting the blame on the victims again. So we are reinforcing like this sort of like narrative in which in the end, it's all fault of the Black community. So if you get killed, it's your fault. If the homicide does not get solved, it's your fault because your people or the community you're living in, they're not helping the police. That's another hypothesis that, people are actually bringing up. Now, even though I do not have the answer and I cannot subscribe to any of those, I can certainly say that this final perspective, hypothesis, let's say, it's very distasteful, let's say, to put it into mild words. And I really hope that in the future there will be more research to try to, fill that gap, to try to understand why is that. Now, with this data, with this design, you can do that. But hopefully there will be more efforts to go in that direction now that, we finally have the answer on whether the gap exists or not.
Well, and that kind of leads me to my next question, which is, what are the, and you might not have the answer to this, but speculation, the agencies, the police agencies that have to report this data are resistant to report it. And I've been struggling to figure out why they're resistant. Why don't they want this national database of crime and how successful they are?
So it's a complicated question because I think in the US, we're talking about more than 17,000 police agencies. So it's a universe. It's a very complex universe. So there's definitely not just one answer to that. Before I try to answer, however, let me give you a split pill. I come from a country in which data on crime, data on police, data on criminal justice systems are absent. So even though the US have problems, they are, decades forward from the situation in which Italy is. And being a criminologist in Italy, it's very difficult for that reason. But now, coming back to your question, I think in many cases, there might be more than one explanation. One thing is maybe, people just don't believe that data can help, that partnering with academia or with research institutions can help them. They don't simply believe, modern statistical technologies can help. They're just, boot on the ground and, I know my people, I know how to deal with that. I don't need numbers. I don't need math. That might be one explanation. Then, of course, there's the hypothesis that probably, that would mean having much more pressure on their backs. Because if the situation in your county or your city is not as good as you want it to be, if you submit data and you put them into the public, people, researchers, but also like normal people will be able to investigate them and will draw some conclusion that probably will hurt you. So there's a lot of potential explanations. There's laziness, being not really effective or just being overwhelmed by other duties or tasks that police agencies have to deal with, and they don't have time to deal with that too. Now, in 2022, I think the NIBRS system became mandatory, and the good news about that, at least we're seeing an increasing trend in terms of like the percentage of agencies reporting. So hopefully that will continue to increase. Because otherwise, it's going to be, now that the UCR system is not in place anymore, there's going to be a problem of, can we continue doing research on crime if the data are not are not made public? And I think, especially in the US, in which there's a lot of connection between academia and police and criminal justice, and there have been laws or interventions or policies that were backed up by existing research, it's gonna be tricky, right? So I really hope that police agencies will continue to increase their compliance rates, because in the past that was not the case. Yeah.
Well, thank you for explaining all this in your work. And just a final kind of curiosity question: how long did it take you to do all this data crunching and pulling all this stuff together?
So let's say that was not the only project I've been working on in that period, but I would say a solid couple of years, not full time, but finding, let's say it was more of a challenge for testing all possible robustness models to make sure that my results were not just driven by one lucky configuration of my stats or the data, but making sure that, every other possible, being the devil's advocate here. So that took months, and then presenting the paper to other colleagues. Some were very welcoming, some other pushed back a little on the conclusions, but that's for another story, I guess. And so, I would say a couple of years was the range, which is not the longest I've been working on a project, by the way, but definitely not one of the shortest.
That was going to be my final question. What are you working on currently? Do you have anything coming out in the next year or so, 2 years?
So I've been working on a lot of things, actually. Let's say that the project that is more, the closest to conclusion is a project based in Italy, when we actually use machine learning approaches to predict the municipalities that are at risk of being infiltrated by mafias and organized crime. And we use that to understand whether, we use a measure based on that to understand whether European funds that are issued to southern municipalities attracted the mafias. But I'm also working on other projects based on the United States. I'm at the beginning of a project, hopefully with a colleague from Rutgers University, where we're actually looking at homicide clearance and how not being able to clear cases might increase homicides. So whether, you see this bump because people that are the perpetrators are still out there committing crime. So those two definitely, but then I'm at the beginning of other projects looking at the impact of homicides on how people change their planning routines in American cities. And then I'm also working on a PhD student, very talented one, who's a former mathematician here at the University of Trento. We're trying to create this deep learning artificial intelligence models to try to predict crime and microgeographical units at the American cities with fine-grained temporal units. So it's going to be a long project, but certainly exciting.